Compañero, welcome. My name is Carlos El Chacon, and my podcast aims to bring you together with others working with SQL Server and engage in conversations to share ideas, meet old friends, and make a few new friends along the way. I call it the SQL Trail. Thanks for joining me.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome back to the SQL Trail. This is episode 130, and today our episode is about PowerShell. We're talking with Warren Estes about some of the use cases that he's used PowerShell, where it's come in handy. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily getting started, but one of the things we like to do on this program is to talk about how others are using technology. And I think this is a great scenario in which Warren's done some very interesting things. And I think that we can all benefit to put some context potentially in place as to how PowerShell can be helping us. Before we get into that conversation, however, we do have a couple of Compañero shout-outs. We are just finishing up our SQL Saturday here in Richmond, and I want to give a shout-out. I know we talked about it in the previous episode about organizing SQL Saturday, but I want to give a shout-out to all those organizers who might be listening. I know it's a lot of work. Wayne Sheffield leads our event now here in Richmond, and he was just absolutely exhausted afterwards. He and Jamie Wick did an excellent job. And so shout outs to all of you who are putting in time and energy to put on events like that. I know that I appreciate them when I go, and I can say the same for the event that we had in Richmond. I also want to give shout outs to several of the speakers I was able to catch up with. All right, so we've got Jana. Most of these are previous episode attendees or panelists. Jonathan Stewart, Kevin Fiesel, Anders Peterson, who need to get on the program, and then Brian Carrig from Channel Advisor. So good to catch up with those guys. And although Brian was feeling a little bit sick, Brian, I hope if you're listening, I hope you're feeling better. And we got some good feedback from episode 128 with John Morehouse. So among those chiming in with some feedback, Aaron Walker, Tim Harkin, Andrew Pruski, Elizabeth Noble, Dialed-in Ali. I'm sorry. Hopefully Dialed-in, I got that name right. If I butchered it, I apologize. Bartzots Ratajik. And we also had a couple of takers for follow-up episodes, and so I'm hoping to schedule some time with Alex Yates and Tom Norman for a future episode about continuous deployment to the database. I don't have any tips and tricks today. However, I do want to follow up with the SQL Trail Conference. That conference continues to come together. I can now officially say that Kevin Fiesel, Jonathan Stewart, and Doug Purnell will be back this year. They came in 2017 and are back for seconds. So our venue will be the very lovely Virginia Historical Society in downtown Richmond. The dates are October 10th through the 12th, and registration should open in May. So I'm still working out the details on the website. Obviously, we're hopeful that we're going to have a few more speakers, and I am excited about doing this again. So we'll continue to put out some information at SQLtrail.com. Again, unfortunately, if you go there right now, there may still be a couple of template things out there, but that should be getting all organized here very soon. So if as you're planning for your training in the later part of this year and you want to come spend time with us, we hope that you'll consider that, and we'd of course love to see you. Now, for you regular listeners of the show, we know that we have made some changes to the program. So, compañeros, in an attempt to get you the best episodes possible, one of the things that has worked very well in the past is having someone on to help be part of the conversation. And so Eugene Meidinger has agreed to do that. And so Eugene is going to be visiting us from time to time. Yeah. You might think of him as a recurring guest on the podcast. And so we wanted to welcome him and chat with him for a second. So welcome.
Yeah, thank
Eugene.
you. No, I'm really excited about the opportunity. And it's funny how it came up because I'd been asking you about, what's involved with running a podcast, because I think that's something that's way on the bucket list down at the bottom. So whenever you asked me to help out, I was pretty excited.
So there are more and more podcasts coming out. And when you said, hey, I'm thinking about this. And I also know that there are a lot of podcasts that start and never get past episode 10, for example.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, hey, if you're interested in kind of seeing what it's like, it makes sense to come on. And then, of course, you can help this knuckle-dragging Neanderthal out from time to time.
Absolutely.
In some of our conversations. So So now, ultimately, your background, I know you've been talking a lot about Power BI.
Yeah.
You've been on our program before.
Yep.
So 104, that was the Keeping Up with Technology episode.
Yep.
And so I know you've been talking a lot about Power BI and whatnot, but I guess go ahead and maybe tell us a little bit about your background and some of the things you've been doing.
It's interesting because I kind of fell into the SQL world and then fell into business intelligence and that sort of thing. And a couple of years ago, I decided that I wanted to actually be an expert at something. And so I picked Power BI because it just seemed like it fit with being part of the SharePoint team where I work and the fact that Microsoft was just dumping marketing money on Power BI.
Right. You're like, something must be going on here.
Yeah. And so I've decided I'm just going to become an expert in the area. And recently it's been working out. So I actually went part-time last year so I could do more training and stuff. So I'm going to be doing like 4 pre-cons on Power BI this year.
Wow.
By the time this podcast comes out, my second course on Pluralsight on Power BI should be out. So this year is like really exciting.
Yeah. Well, and we are excited to have you on the program. And so, again, just by the nature of schedules and whatnot, you may not be on all the episodes,
Right.
But as many as you can come on, obviously, we'd love to have you and to be part of that conversation. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's definitely an honor. I really do appreciate the invitation.
Now, since recording that with Eugene, I can say that he won't be the only panelist that we have in the future. And admittedly, I'm actually open to more compañeros potentially joining in. And so if you're interested in joining the conversation, let me know. We'd love to have you. What I think I have a couple of folks that have expressed interest in being available. And as they are able, when the guest schedules and they're available at that time, we'll have a few more people. And if you're interested in being part of that pool, let me know. And I'd love to chat with you more about it. So for today's episode, the show notes will be at SQLDataPartners.com/PowerShell or at SQLDataPartners.com/130. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. Okay, so Warren, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Carlos.
We had you on the program today. We wanted to talk with you about PowerShell. You've been doing quite a bit, talking about PowerShell in different places. And so we're glad to have you on and talk with you a bit about that. And I want to go ahead and kick things off. So we've talked about PowerShell before in this program, but you have some interesting takes on this or some interesting experiences. And the first one that I want to jump into was actually an experience that you talked about in working with cross-functional teams. And I think more and more compañeros, the folks who are listening to the show, they are going to be working in cross-functional environments. So this might be either environments where there's more than one database technology, or with the advent of SQL Server on Linux, now we have additional operating systems to deal with. And in my mind, maybe we could argue the finer points there, but in my mind, having a separate operating system is also kind of a cross-functional type idea. And so you talked about working with a team in Oracle, and you were doing some integration work, or the data had to move around, and you created a solution in PowerShell. So why don't we start there? Tell us a little bit about that and how you use PowerShell to solve your problem.
Sure. Yeah, we have a bunch of different platforms that we use. We have Linux, we have Windows, we have Oracle, we have SQL Server, we have some other flavors in there as well. And I am, I guess, the resident SQL Server expert. So I get roped into a bunch of different problems,
Sure.
Which is great. I'm exposed to a bunch of different things. And this was a specific problem where they, of course, promised something to the customer. And when it came down to it, they were struggling on their end with how to resolve that problem. And later, iterating through my mind the different things that I could utilize to solve this problem came down to PowerShell. It's not always my first choice, but in the end, it's usually the best choice and quickest choice. So what I needed to do is just simply create a function to measure throughput from a Oracle Golden Gate standpoint, and then publish that to a website, or at least a text file that the website could pull from. And it was something that was done very quickly with PowerShell within a matter of approximately 30 minutes. They spent days trying to figure this out. So it was very simple.
Set the stage here. You had an Oracle database that was publishing data. And again, so knuckle dragging the Neanderthal. I'm not sure if the Golden Gate is like an application, or is there some, I guess it's a monitoring tool almost? It's publishing that throughput data. And the goal was to get it from the Oracle system into this web service tier.
Correct. They wanted to be able to publish the throughput metric.
Gotcha.
And the easiest thing was just a simple simple PowerShell function.
Hey, SQL Server guy, come help us solve this Oracle problem.
Right. What was it? Yeah, it was on a Windows box. So we were all huddled around trying to figure it out with SQL CMD. And somebody mentioned Python, and they're all huddled around. And, my head popped up from 5 cubes over, and I said, just do it with PowerShell.
So then, I guess, obviously, you've been working with it, right? So what made you pop up and say, hey, PowerShell would be the way to go here?
Just the integration into the operating system, the ease of use. I had been working with it now approximately 5 or 6 years on and off.
Okay.
So it's something that I don't use daily, but it's something that I always find myself, going back to.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So I guess that integration, so Oracle running on Windows, right? That idea of being able to communicate with, interface with the various applications, I can see how that would make PowerShell very convenient. Now, one of the other things you talk about, and I'm jumping here a little bit, is the use of .NET libraries, right? Or being able to use other folks' code. Now, I am not a coder. I can read some code. I can help, support it or troubleshoot it. Other than some T-SQL code, I'm not writing C# or any of those other languages. And that sounds like a pretty big chasm to me. But let's talk a little bit about that idea of actually using .NET libraries or other code that people have written, for example, to extend the abilities of what we're able to do with PowerShell. It seems super complicated, right? Is it something that I need to be super concerned about, or is it actually a little bit more straightforward than maybe I know?
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
It's wonderful to have pre-written code out there. Having the .NET framework is absolutely amazing. There's all these assemblies that you can utilize to interact with, let's say, SQL Server, like the SMO. And there are other different .NET assemblies that you can utilize pre-written code for as well. The only caveat to that is you need to know exactly which one you want to load, but something like the SQL Server provider takes care of that for you. But I always love the idea of pre-written code. So the .NET framework is a game changer.
Give me some examples of a .NET library that you've used. And obviously for our audience, right, we're kind of interested in the SQL Server components. And so if the examples don't fit nicely there, we can stretch out a little bit. But under what circumstances did you go out looking? Or I guess because of your coding background, did you already know about these libraries? Like, hey, I could just use this and plug it in. So tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. So the different assemblies, generally, it takes some hunting to figure out which assemblies you need. I'll just go back to the example of the SQL Server provider and the SQL Server management objects. There's a list, a bunch of assemblies that you need to load to do certain tasks and certain things. You can definitely hunt those out and use those explicitly, but there's only, I think, a dozen or so, maybe more, that you can just load them all. Doesn't take very long, and it covers the basics of what you can do through PowerShell and SQL Server.
So Warren, still trying to learn PowerShell, but I do have some experience with C#, and maybe you can help me understand kind of where PowerShell fits and some of this extensibility, because to me, whenever I look at it, it seems like PowerShell is basically if C# was born as a loosely typed language or a dynamic language instead of being statically typed and so rigid. Is that a good way of thinking about it, or is PowerShell kind of its own animal?
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. It's kind of almost like a higher level above C#. It's not as rigid. And most languages kind of fall somewhere between strong and weak. But with the addition of desired state configuration, even though PowerShell is procedural, it does expose some sort of declarative aspect with the desired state configuration, which allows you to, instead of saying what you need in a procedural way, you can just say what you desire, and that desired state configuration takes care of that for you in the background.
Right. So it's a little bit more like SQL, where you're telling it what you want to get to instead of do 1, do 2, do 3, and all the little steps in between, right?
Right. It's like the T-SQL would be, if you say tea, Earl Grey hot, and SQL Server takes care of that in the background and produces a nice cup of hot tea for you, as opposed to PowerShell, where you need to describe the steps, go to the kitchen, boil the water,
right,
pour into the cup, add the tea, that sort of a process.
So circling back a little bit, but related to what we were just talking about, you talked about how you were able to put together this kind of cross-functional solution, like 30 minutes. And I can definitely see how PowerShell could be really good for quick solutions. But since it is more of a scripting language instead of C#, which is much more rigid, what's the kind of prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot? Because with C#, you have the compiler that like smacks your wrist and says, bad programmer.
Right.
So is there more of a risk of kind of shooting yourself in the foot with PowerShell because it'll do whatever you tell it to?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's the plus and minus. You can build a solution very quickly, but also the compiler is not going to throw an error and say, hey, you can't use these two variables together. One's one type and one's another. They can't be used together.
So it sounds like there's just some trial and error involved there. And obviously the testing of the code still plays an important role there.
Yeah, you definitely need to unit test. And Pester is a great example of testing that you need to do. I'm new to the Pester world. It was something that I only did for a project where I contributed to the reporting services tools.
Okay.
So it was a wake-up call that need to unit test, and it's a must-have.
Right. Yeah. And so in my mind, I cannot think about PowerShell without thinking about DBA tools. And so you bring up Pester. And I know that one of Christie's last posts was about that, and ultimately kind of some of the integration that they're looking to do, if that's the right word, with Pester, but that idea to be able to put unit tests in your PowerShell. And so that might be an interesting conversation to come back to and actually just explore a little bit more about Pester in another episode. It sounds like there is quite a bit there, and you have to kind of think about that. Like unit tests. I mean, unit tests are kind of its own universe in a sense, right? You either know them and you've gotten good at doing that, or you're struggling to, and sometimes it's hard to find the value there. But obviously, in your case, you mentioned committing code to another project, and they're like, well, hey, you have to go through the unit test route. And so again, almost that culture invites this idea of having to put it together.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to contribute garbage to an open source project.
Right.
Testing is imperative. It's huge.
You talked a little bit about this cross-functional thing. And I know, Eugene, you've been playing a lot with the Power BI stuff. So any add-ins or specific tie-ins there? What's the best way to find out if there are integrations for the tools that we're using?
I think it's a little bit of everything, a little bit of searching on the interwebs, Twitter, SQL help,
Okay,
PowerShell hashtag. I've looked at the PowerShell repository, trying to find solutions. And that's where I found the reporting services tools for SSRS. And just Googled that and found a lot of different solutions. I'm not an SSRS person by any means. So it was definitely not difficult to find a solution when I searched for it, PowerShell and SSRS.
interesting. So that is going to bring me to the next point that I wanted to talk about anyway. And that is this piece that you actually contributed to the SSS PowerShell library. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's the official Microsoft Reporting Services Tools module.
Okay, there we go. And so, compañeros, if you ever had to bulk update subscriptions in SSRS, you're going to know what I'm talking about here. And so an example that we came across, and I wish I'd had this conversation about 8 months ago, upgrading SSRS from, I believe must have been 2008 to 2016. And this was to come in a Word doc, is what the attachment, and the attachment type had changed from 2008 to 2016. And so it was invalid in the new version. You think, okay, well, hey, no problem. Just go in and with an update statement, that would do that. But if you've ever had to update those subscriptions, you'll see that there's actually a text field and there's lots of data in there. I don't remember if it's XML, but it's bracketed somehow, or it's, delimited somehow. And then, of course, every report is a little bit different. So coming up with a T-SQL script to go in there and substrings and, try to find the right thing, and then you not messing up, is pretty hard, right? It's pretty difficult. So there was no good way to do that with T-SQL. So when I saw this was very interesting, and that ability to be able to update multiple subscriptions at what time. So maybe let's talk a little bit about this. And obviously, so there is definitely a need. You saw it. I've seen it. How did you go about, working on that and then submitting that back to Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. I followed almost the same path as you did. I had a problem at work where we had a migration and we had hundreds of subscriptions that needed to be stopped at a certain date and time, and then hundreds of subscriptions that needed to be enabled at a certain day and time.
Right.
And I could have simply just disabled them all and then enabled the ones that needed to be enabled, but that seemed like too much work. And I wanted even lazier and schedule this out. So I looked at I think it's the contents column. I don't remember what it was, but it's XML. And anything with XML and T-SQL is just not a good time. You can update, I think, convert it to varchar max and then replace a certain field in there and then convert it back. I don't remember the steps, but then having to actually add a node in the XML it wasn't happening. So I looked to the Microsoft Reporting Services Tools module, and it didn't have anything available to do this. So I created it, and it turns out that this was something that people thought would be good.
So now, are all the components of the subscription available for update, or is this specific to just a couple of items?
This one is specific only for the start date, end date time, and the owner currently.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's the do tell. Compañeros want to know. Are you going to be adding on to this? Is there other functionality that might be in the future?
Could be, absolutely. I'm looking to see what else we can change. I just threw it in there with these 3 updates as baby steps.
Sure.
So it cut down on the pester code testing as well.
Okay, compañeros, I want to hear from you right about this episode. If you would like to see additional options in that subscription, I'd be very interested in knowing it. Obviously, I think Warren would be interested. And we'd like to see what direction. Obviously, because it's an open source, if you're looking to contribute, that's another opportunity there. And so we'd be interested to see what kind of feedback we get there. That's fun. That's pretty cool. Like I said, I wish I'd had that 8 months ago, but I will definitely keep it in mind the next time I'm looking to do some SSRS updates.
A quick question about that. It seems like 5 years ago, being able to contribute to an official Microsoft module would have been unheard of. So, I mean, it seems like with just everything that's been going on, they're becoming more and more open source and more open to the community. So I just think it's kind of interesting that this is something that you could do, and 5 or 10 years ago would have been like blasphemy, right?
Sure. Or even like, how would you get it in? I mean, you'd have to email 100 people, right?
Right, they weren't on GitHub. It's
exactly. You'd have to know somebody. It was a big impenetrable fortress.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised when I suggested this as a new function, and they were happily receiving this and interacting with me and giving me pointers. So it was definitely a paradigm shift from the old school Microsoft.
No, I guess I'm curious. So was that experience positive enough that you would recommend or suggest that other folks take a whack at it if they have an idea that they'd like to contribute to?
Yeah, absolutely. You can suggest changes, open up bug reports. Claudio Silva, I believe, was part of decision-making and accepting this function.
Gotcha.
But it wasn't as open, I would say, as something like DBA tools.
Sure.
I know DBA tools. I mean, Christian Lemaire's always on Slack. I don't know when she sleeps.
That's
It's absolutely amazing. There are people on there that are just incredible. And the first time I did a presentation on PowerShell with DBA tools, I believe there were 160 or so functions, commandlets, and now there are 460 or 80. It's insane.
Oh, wow, that many.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like being the lazy person that I am. And I guess I just have other, maybe interests is the right word, or where my world is. I can take advantage of some of the other things that people are doing. But I do find that that's how I am experiencing PowerShell a little bit right now. I am kind of waiting, or a lot of where my needs are is being met by the community. And I don't have to dive in.
Right. That's the beauty of DBA tools. And they should really rename it from DBA tools to DBA framework, because it's essentially a framework for being a production. You're going to migrate things from one instance to another. I use copy DBA login all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Testing connections, disk space. And when I need to migrate, I'm definitely using DBA tools.
I think it's always interesting to hear actual use cases, because sometimes I'm a little skeptical, because it sounds like this golden hammer that you can just whack all your problems with and fix everything. So
Right.
It's always nice to hear about specific solutions. So it's easier to imagine, like, oh, I could see you doing that. Updating things in SSRS with PowerShell. Like, now you're speaking my language, because I get so mad because data-driven subscriptions for SSRS are only available in Enterprise Edition. So if you want to send the same email report to 20 different employees, but have it modified so it has their employee number, if you don't have Enterprise Edition, you're manually creating 20 subscriptions. So I can definitely easily imagine having a use for that sort of thing. So I really appreciate just hearing some actual use cases versus just, it's rainbows and unicorns and it's going to solve every problem you have.
And that's the goal of this podcast, is to make that technology a little more usable, right? Give you some context into how to use it.
There are rainbows and unicorns in PowerShell, but I agree. Hearing real world examples is far more important than going over the basics for a lot of people. Creating robust solutions to complex problems using PowerShell is super powerful. And although talking about PowerShell kind of feels like, I'm a CrossFitter or, somebody that just discovered gluten-free,
Right.
But it really is oftentimes the solution to a problem. Just kind of download DBA tools, go through the code there because it's really well written. That's kind of how I learned along the way.
Sure.
And it's a great framework for any DBA.
You wrote a post in December of last year about dynamically creating restore scripts. Now, you chose to do that dynamic creation in T-SQL. So I guess I am curious, what are the parameters or what maybe there's a thought process or the guidelines that you use to decide, okay, hey, it makes more sense to solve this with SQL, or hey, it makes more sense to solve this with PowerShell?
Sure. I actually started that process kind of by accident. It kind of snowballed into this larger project, and with a team of 5 or 6 individuals that weren't PowerShell literate, they were just more comfortable with T-SQL. So giving them bits and pieces, it kind of snowballed into this much larger script. It wasn't a procedure because we didn't want to have it on every single instance. We have hundreds of instances across a couple different domains. So having something that they can just copy and paste without having to worry about loading DBA tools or, the PowerShell version made more sense at the time.
Interesting. So I think the ability for your teammates to consume that might play a role in that decision. Now, I am curious, right? So we are fast forward a couple of months. If you had to make that decision again, you always want to start small, right? But if you knew that it was going to get bigger, would you still make that same choice in this specific scenario?
I would, just simply because I love writing code. So it was just kind of like a daily challenge to add more and add more and add more. Okay. But if I'm doing a restore, I'm using DBA tools myself.
So should we go ahead and do SQL Family?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Warren, tell us, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
I started when the .com boom hit. I joined a startup as an IT and worked my way into a developer DBA hybrid type role and have loved it ever since. I actually, on a side note, didn't like my database course in college.
Hey, a man of my own heart.
To be fair, it was Oracle, though, so I had reason to not like it.
The same with me. Now, having worked with that SQL Server for that long, and obviously you had a developer background as well, but if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
Can I change 2 things?
We can be generous today.
We might allow it.
One's, I'm sure you guys hear it a lot, but changing read, commit, and snapshot isolation to the default would be one. And the other one would be make it a little bit harder to install, because I come across so many accidental installs or incorrect installs that I have to mop up, and I'm not happy about those.
Yeah, but how many of those are expressed?
I don't want to say.
There you go. That's an interesting question or dilemma there, right?
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to accept that change request.
They've got a Docker image now. You're just out of luck.
Well, maybe you can convince them to get that Docker image straight. I feel your pain there. But at the same time, that is a lot of the way that I earn my living now, is by cleaning those up. So I guess another reason for me to not be so anxious about that change.
Right. Good news, bad news.
What's the best piece of career advice you've received?
I actually heard the best piece of career advice on your podcast.
Oh, here we go.
By Jen McCowan. And I'm paraphrasing, but I believe she said, you always want to make your next move uncomfortable, wherever that is. So you don't always want to move into another position where you're comfortable. That speaks to me because I love that growth mindset where you want to grow and do things differently.
Our last question for you today, Warren. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Boy, I would definitely want to be able to speak any language fluently.
Nice.
My wife and I travel a lot, and although I can usually speak enough to get around where we're going, it usually always leads to me immediately regretting it when they think I can speak fluently. So that would resolve that.
There you go. Now, are you from the States?
Yes,
Okay. So you travel a lot. Is there a specific area or just all over?
pretty much anywhere. We like to alternate between Europe and somewhere nice and warm.
Nice.
Okay. Very good. Awesome.
But yeah, this last name makes it ethnically ambiguous, especially with my tan complexion.
That's funny.
Gets me in trouble, especially when we go to Spain.
Yes, that's right. Especially if you get the sound down, then
yeah.
then
Gracias.
you're like, hey,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Warren, awesome. Thank you so much for being on the program today. We do appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Had a great
It's
time.
been great. So special thanks to Eugene Meidinger for co-hosting with me today in today's episode. We're looking forward to having Eugene back a bit more. Obviously, that won't be all the time. We have recorded a few other episodes without him, but we're hoping to keep him in the mix. I also think it's very, very cool, and I am interested in hearing from a few more of you who may have contributed code. We've talked about the DBA tools. Obviously, I think that would still apply. But if you're contributing to the Windows libraries in Git, I'd love to hear about your experience, what you're doing there, what problems you're trying to solve. I think those are always very, very interesting things to talk about. We'd love to bring them out here on the show. I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks again to Warren for visiting with us. You can reach out to me, compañeros, if you have other topics that you think we should be talking about on social media. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I am at Carlos L. Chacon, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.